Just had to press record now. Okay, so thank you all for joining today's webinar. My name is Cassandra Cubes. I work on ACEEE's Clean Power Plan team, and I will be moderating today's webinar. First, before we dive into the presentations, a few words on administration. Everyone, all attendees are in mute. So if you have a question, we're going to save all of those questions for our Q&A at the very end of the webinar, the last 15 minutes or so. So we ask that you please type in your questions as you think of them in your chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out the link to view the recording along with the slide deck in about a week or so after the webinar. So keep your eyes open for that email. So first, a little bit about this webinar series in general. ACEEE is launching our first ever ACEEE webinar series called Energy Efficiency and the Clean Power Plan. So this webinar is actually the first one in this series. Overall, we will have 5 webinars, 1 per month, that will last through July. And each of these webinars is really an opportunity to explore the role of energy efficiency and how it can be used for Clean Power Plan compliance. Each webinar will highlight ACEEE's latest research, and that emphasizes best practices in program and policy design, and it will feature presentations from both our Clean Power Plan team and our program staff here at ACEEE. And so the upcoming topics you can see listed there. We'll have our next webinar next month in April. It will be on low-income energy efficiency programs and investments. And then we'll have another on opportunities for the industrial sector. And then also we'll have one on paying for energy efficiency in the Clean Power Plan, how to incentivize it, and how to go about doing things like financing your energy efficiency programs. And then the last one you see there is the people's choice. So actually on our next webinar, we're going to have a poll that you can choose your topic from. So whichever one gets the most votes, that's what we'll have. And that'll be our last one in July. And so there you see the link at the bottom. Again, these slides will be available at the end of this webinar shortly thereafter, so you can access them there. But this is a link to a recent blog post that includes all of the various registration links for each of the webinars. So now getting into today's webinar. This webinar called Building on Existing Efforts, State Policy and Clean Power Plan Outlook will highlight the energy efficiency policies and programs states have in place that can be relied on for Clean Power Plan compliance. We'll hear from Annie Gillio, ACEEE's State Policy Manager. She manages ACEEE's state-based technical assistance activities and conducts research on energy efficiency resource standards, the utility business model, and other state-level policies. Annie was also the lead author of the 2013 through 2015 editions of the State Energy Efficiency Scorecard, and she will be highlighting a lot of the results from our 2015 scorecard for you today. We will also be hearing from Sarah Hayes. Sarah Hayes is our Senior Manager for Air and Climate Policy. She brings over 15 years of experience to ACEEE and leads our work on clean air and the environment and conducting analysis of national policies and proposed regulations. She's also the lead of our Clean Power Plan team. And she will be talking about how each of the different regions are focusing on Clean Power Plan at the moment, and we'll tie in both an introduction and overview of the Clean Power Plan, as long as next steps and where we're going next at the end of the webinar. So now I'm going to hand things over to Sarah.
Thanks, Cassandra. So just briefly what we're going to cover, we've got a lot to cover today. Annie's going to talk about some of the highlights from our research on efficiency in all of the 50 states in a lot of different categories. We're going to identify some states where energy efficiency is supported, as well as some states where there's a lot of opportunity. And we're also going to talk about big opportunities that we expect in the different regions and in key states in the coming year. As Cassandra said, we're going to look at all of that with the lens of the Clean Power Plan and what states are thinking about and doing in relation to energy efficiency. Next slide. So just a little bit of context. The Clean Power Plan, abbreviated CPP, is an environmental regulation that EPA has drafted to regulate existing power plants, and it's going to limit carbon dioxide emissions from those power plants. In this case, existing means that on-site improvements are limited and can be more expensive than other methods of reducing pollution. So you've already built the power plant, now what are you going to do is kind of the question, which leads to efficiency. Why does efficiency come into play? Because some of the other options for reducing pollution from a power plant that's already constructed are more expensive and are a little bit more limited. Energy efficiency works by saving electricity, and when you save electricity, or you reduce electric generation, and that reduces emissions. EPA has recognized this in the rulemaking, and we are glad they did, because energy efficiency is something that all states can take advantage of, and regardless of what approach they take for compliance, if they go rate-based or mass-based, which are some of the different options that they have to select from in the Clean Power Plan, if they're already in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, if they're looking to act early and be a leader, if they're trying to incentivize low income, if they're looking to maintain electric affordability for their customers, all of these things can encompass energy efficiency as a strategy to help achieve the goal. It costs less than many of the other compliance options, and there's a lot of it. In every state, there's a lot of untapped cost-effective energy efficiency, and we've done some analysis using a tool called Super 2, which is available to all of you, and we'll show you a link later. But essentially, we found that most states can meet half, if not all, of their 2030 compliance goals with the adoption of some well-established energy efficiency policies and programs. And just quickly, what kind of energy efficiency are we talking about when we talk about compliance with the Clean Power Plan? It's kind of the kitchen sink. This list came from EPA, but it is by no means a limit on what kinds of energy efficiency states might consider using in their Clean Power Plan compliance plans. So I'm not going to read through the list. You can see what's there, but it really is a broad array. And just a quick word on the Supreme Court stay. If you're following this at all, you probably have read an article or seen a headline about this. There have been, as there always are to environmental regulations, some court challenges, and the Supreme Court has issued just recently a stay that suspends the rulemaking. It doesn't necessarily delay things. So there's been a lot of speculation and questions about what does this mean for the rulemaking process and what happens going forward. The Clean Air Act is still there. It hasn't changed. The court did not in any way rule on the merits of the regulation itself. And CO2 regulation, because it's required under the Clean Air Act, it's still coming. Half of the states, if not more, are still planning for compliance. And what compliance means, you know, is it exactly the rule that we've seen, some other approach to reducing greenhouse gases from existing power plants? That does remain to be seen. But EPA has said they're going to proceed with developing guidance and helping states figure out how to navigate the CPP. Many states and state actors are on a steep learning curve for energy efficiency. And in particular, I think an important example there is that we've been doing efficiency for decades. We have very limited experience using it for compliance with environmental regulations. So there are a couple of states that have some limited experience applying the pollution reductions from energy efficiency to show compliance with an EPA regulation. But those are really not the norm, they're the exception. And so we think that this time that may be created with the stay is actually an opportunity we could take advantage of to help get the word out and let people learn and recognize the opportunity efficiency provides and what opportunities we're not yet taking advantage of. And if you haven't seen this resource yet, I'm not going to go through all these, but I highly recommend it. E&E puts this together, and they're tracking which states are actively planning for Clean Power Plan compliance, which are assessing, which are suspending. And I just want to also point out that this is what states have publicly said. So the blue states have publicly said, we're still developing plans. I know that some of the states that are red are also still talking about plans. They're just not doing it quite so publicly. So according to this map, there are 19 states that have actively said they're planning. I would argue that there are quite a few more that are still planning. It's just not quite so transparent. And I'm going to hand it over to Annie now to talk about where some of the opportunities and big activities are.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So I wanted to just take the opportunity to walk through some of the trends that we're already seeing when it comes to energy efficiency across the country. Sarah mentioned that there are a host of options that states have for using energy efficiency in their compliance plans, and states are already taking advantage of a lot of those options. So one of the ways that we're seeing major investments in energy efficiency across the country is through utility sector programs. So these are ratepayer-funded programs delivered by utilities and third parties. And here you can see the trends in spending over time. So in 2014, we saw actual spending on ratepayer-funded efficiency rise to about over $7 billion across all the states. In terms of absolute dollars, California spent the most on energy efficiency, about $1.2 billion on electric programs and another $342 million on gas programs. If you look at it in terms of spending as a percentage of total utility retail sales, we're seeing Rhode Island and Massachusetts as the leaders in this sector. So all of that spending translates into savings. Here we're looking at net incremental savings from customer-funded energy efficiency programs, and we saw about a 6% growth between 2013 and 2014 for a total of 25.7 million megawatt hours of new savings delivered that year through ratepayer-funded programs. Median savings as a percentage of retail sales was about 0.56% overall. Rhode Island saved the most as a percentage of retail sales, more than 3%, in fact 3.5%, followed by Massachusetts, Vermont, and California. Again, in terms of absolute megawatt hour savings, we're seeing California as the largest saver in the United States with about 4 million megawatt hours of electric savings that year. So Sarah mentioned that we collect a lot of this data through our State Energy Efficiency Scorecard, which is a product that we put out every year that looks at a variety of energy efficiency policies across the country. And here you're looking at our 2015 rankings. I think the scorecard is a really useful tool when thinking about the Clean Power Plan because it essentially lays out a gap analysis for every state. Who's doing what well? What are the gaps that can be filled through policies to promote energy efficiency? Who are the states to look at as models? So here you'll see the states that are darkest brown in color are the highest ranking states. The lighter states rank toward the bottom of the scale. And the other thing I'd point out is that energy efficiency is not limited to the coast, but we're seeing real activity and movement across the country. The scorecard looks at a variety of policies, but we do pay a lot of attention to policies to promote energy efficiency in the utility sector, and one of those policies that I thought was important to point out is the Energy Efficiency Resource Standard. We see these policies as big drivers of savings. All of the top 15 or so savers in the state scorecard had EERS policies in place in the last year. So just a few things to watch. Massachusetts recently set new 3-year targets that take it to more than 2.9% savings. So it's really aggressively saving energy and has plans to continue over the next 3 years. It's not just the Northeast, of course. Arkansas has continued its 0.9% target through 2019. So the first state in the Southeast to adopt an EERS, and it is committed to continuing those savings through smart policies. The gray state here is Indiana, who rolled back their EERS a couple of years ago. The other state in the Midwest
that we are paying attention to is Ohio, who has frozen their efficiency standard. We're still seeing utilities implement programs during the course of the freeze, but this is a critical year for figuring out what's next for Ohio. We also are watching some states as they develop these policies. So Delaware is in the process of setting targets for its utilities. Mississippi is coming up on phase 2 of their efficiency programs, and under that phase they are required to set targets, so that's something they should be thinking about over the next year or so. Similarly, Louisiana is coming up on their next phase of efficiency. Although they're not required to set targets, we do expect some expansion of programs in that. And while EERS policies are important, they're not the only way to incentivize efficiency in the utility sector. Here, I'll just touch on a couple of things about the utility business model. We have some recent publications called Policies Matter that look at the suite of policies that are available to regulators and policymakers to incentivize utilities to invest in energy efficiency. EERS policies are a critical tool in the toolkit, but there are also other things that regulators and policymakers should be paying attention to, including decoupling and performance incentives for utilities. So this map shows those policies for electric utilities, and on the next slide we can see the policies that are in place for gas utilities across the country. So I mentioned that the state scorecard tracks a variety of things. We're not just looking at efficiency in the utility sector. That is one way a state can invest in energy efficiency, and it is easily adopted into a state's compliance plan under the Clean Power Plan. Another thing that states should be looking at is building codes. So here is an image from the Building Codes Assistance Project showing state adoption of commercial building energy codes. As states update building energy codes, they might consider including those increased savings through building energy codes in their compliance plans. And here you'll see residential building energy codes. Just a couple of highlights while we're on these slides about state energy codes and sort of who's leading the way. Illinois and Maryland were the first states to adopt the most up-to-date commercial codes. And they also adopted residential codes of the most recent year. I would also just point out Texas. They've done a lot of work on codes over the past year, and they actually passed legislation requiring updates to 2015 codes, although that same legislation also set a 6-year update cycle as opposed to the 3-year update cycle that we often see in other states. So this is the first chart that I'm going to show you looking at state scorecard results, and I'm going to break it up by region. I'll talk a bit about what we're seeing in terms of policy overall, and then Sarah will take a look at that through the lens of the Clean Power Plan. So here we're looking at state scorecard results for 2015 in the Midwest. And you can see each of those colored blocks represents a different policy area. We award the most points in the utilities category, but there are many other important policy areas for states to consider. Building codes, state government-led initiatives, combined heat and power, and appliance standards are all policy options that states should consider in thinking about Clean Power Plan compliance. We also look at transportation. I won't talk too much about that on this webinar, but of course in the world of efficiency, that's an important area for states to focus on. So just a few notes about policy opportunities in the Midwest. I mentioned the freeze in Ohio and the rollback in Indiana. Ameren in Missouri just had programs approved, which was a big step forward after their initial programs had been rejected by the Commission. And in Michigan, we're watching closely to see what the fate of their energy efficiency targets will be. There's been a lot of back and forth in the state legislature around that policy. Minnesota, of course, is going through their E21 process that's looking at all elements of their utility business model and how to really improve those elements to encourage things like energy efficiency and renewable development. And I think that's all I'll say about the Midwest and turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Annie. And just to, we don't have time to get into every single state, so really what I'm trying to do is give you a flavor and to contrast a little bit to what Annie has done, which is to convey hard data that we've collected. My what I'm sharing is a little bit less, it's softer. It's a little bit more of a sense of what's going on, and these things are evolving day to day and will depend on your perspective. So with that disclaimer, in the Midwest on Clean Power Plan, it dominates a lot of discussions, but as Annie mentioned, there are processes in place where energy efficiency is considered independent of the Clean Power Plan process. So the exercise of merging or blending or connecting those different processes that the states use to advance energy efficiency and to plan for environmental regulation is an important trend that we're seeing across the country. And in the Midwest in particular, we have a real diversity of states that are real leaders and states that have yet to embrace at all much energy efficiency. I contrast here Minnesota and North Dakota. Minnesota is already on track to comply or come close to complying with the 2030 Clean Power Plan goals with no new efforts. They've got existing policies in place that with a couple of planned retirements, the modeling looks like it's going to get them there. Some opportunities we still see in Minnesota are to expand efficiency offerings in the low-income community, to reach out to large industrials which are currently exempted from their energy savings targets, and to expand their private sector energy efficiency program. They have a program in place, but we think there's some opportunity for more contracts to be executed. Compare that with North Dakota, where they have a really challenging goal to reach under the CPP, and much more limited experience with energy efficiency. So they have a lot of work to do. Some opportunities we see for them, we think that job creation is going to be important. So when thinking about energy efficiency policies and programs, that is, I think, an important lens to consider those opportunities in. We think that there is some real potential in the private sector and for businesses, and building relationships there, because there is less experience on the ground in that state with some of the tried and true energy efficiency policies that we are familiar with. Helping people understand what those opportunities are, helping them understand that you are a resource, that there are resources out there, I think is still work that needs to be done. And then I just commented, what if these two states got together? Electricity flows across their borders, and if you're following the Clean Power Plan, you probably have heard that there's this option of interstate trading, and that if you adopt one of the model rules, you'll be trading ready. But I'm not going to speculate about if this is going to happen or what it would look like. It's just something to think about. You know, North Dakota has a lot to do. Minnesota has already done a lot. Is there a partnership there? Next slide. I think we're back to Annie here.
We are. So continuing our regional approach to discussing policy opportunities, I saw someone had asked what the y-axis on this chart is. I should have mentioned these are overall state scorecard scores, so each policy kind of stacks up on top of each other to bring each state to a final score. 50 is the max, so you can see that California, earning well over 40 points, is a high score. They ranked second in the 2015 State Energy Efficiency Scorecard. So in the Northwest, you can see these high scores. We are seeing a lot of leadership. Just a few highlights that I'll quickly touch on. California has new rules around EM&D, as well as a call to double the amount of savings achieved through energy efficiency. So we are seeing a lot of movement there, and I expect that we will continue to see movement over the next couple of years. In general, we see a lot of progress in the Northwest and a real commitment to energy efficiency due to its power planning process, where energy efficiency is considered a true utility resource. So utilities rely on efficiency to meet customer demand in a way that utilities in other parts of the country often don't. We're also seeing states in this region look toward the next generation of building energy codes. So net zero is what California is working toward, and Oregon has also done a lot of work with performance-based codes. So that's my quick run-through of policy opportunities, and I'll turn it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Annie. So in the Northwest, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho are in pretty good shape to comply with the Clean Power Plan. Oregon and Washington have a lot of renewable-based power. They also have a lot of experience deploying energy efficiency. Idaho isn't going to have any coal plants. So all three of those states are pretty well positioned to comply. Montana, on the other hand, has a huge lift from where they are. And what this chart represents is, I mentioned before the tool Super 2. It's our state utility pollution reduction calculator. And you can download it from our website and select a state and select a suite of efficiency measures or other compliance measures, and it will tell you pretty quickly how close that scenario gets you to complying with the 2030 goals in the Clean Power Plan. It'll also tell you how much that costs and what other pollutants you reduce. There's a link to it at the bottom of the page. But what I did to produce this chart was I selected Montana, and then I selected what I internally refer to as our kitchen sink approach. So I picked most of the efficiency policies that we have as options. It includes an energy savings target, building adoption of building energy codes, some construction of combined heat and power, a program that incentivizes energy service contracts in the commercial sector, and behavior programs. And that's what's stacked up on the right. That's what all those things together would get you in terms of a % of emission reductions. And on the left is the amount of reductions they have to get. So certainly efficiency can take out a big chunk there, but Montana is not likely going to comply with everything they have to do with just efficiency. So this is another case where would it make sense for Montana to maybe partner with some of these other states? Don't know, but it looks like they're going to have to figure out something pretty dramatic from business as usual. Next slide. And I think we're back to Annie for the Northeast.
Yep, and there's a lot to talk about in the Northeast. You'll see quite a few states on this slide, and a lot of them are real leaders when it comes to energy efficiency, in large part due to their efforts in utility-delivered energy efficiency or third-party administrator-delivered energy efficiency. So a few highlights. I mentioned that Rhode Island achieved energy savings of over 3% in the past year. That is in part due to their efforts to promote combined heat and power. The utilities use CHP as a resource, and we're seeing a real promotion of that technology in the state. We also see that Rhode Island has strong goals that are set through a stakeholder process and that are designed to deliver all cost-effective energy efficiency. Another state I'll point out, Maryland, was one of our most improved states in the 2015 state scorecard. They set energy savings goals for utilities of over 2%, but the next year may look very different, and in fact we have seen some changes in Maryland over the past year with a change in administration and the dismantling of their energy office by and large. In the Northeast, we're also seeing industrial opt-out as a threat to energy efficiency. So working with utilities to ensure that programs respond to the needs of large customers and that they're delivering a useful and effective program option to those customers is going to be critical. New York, of course, many of you on the phone are probably aware of the sort of upheaval going on in the utility sector there through their REV process, where they are taking a close look at the ways that utilities serve their customers and the ways that they might serve their customers in the future. And what that will mean for efficiency, I would say, in the long term is still to be seen. A few other highlights here. DC does not have to comply with the Clean Power Plan, but in terms of efficiency, they are on track. They have a multi-year contract in the works with their sustainable energy utility. Another state with a third-party administrator, Maine, recently has finalized a new triennial plan. I mentioned a new plan in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Delaware targets, maybe even New Hampshire, so we are watching all of those closely. And Pennsylvania has a phase 3 of energy efficiency slated to start in June, which is fairly consistent with what we've seen from the state in the past. We're also seeing states in this region look closely at appliance standards, which is a policy area typically driven by California, but we're seeing both Massachusetts and Rhode Island look carefully at state-led appliance standards. And Sarah, take it away.
So, where Annie had a lot to say about the Northeast, I have a lot less to say. And there's why. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is the cap and trade program in the region that is already regulating greenhouse gases from power plants. And if you follow the price of RGGI allowances, you have seen that they've been pretty steadily increasing with the rulemaking as the rulemaking progresses. And I think that is reflective of the assumption by so many people that RGGI is going to be the mechanism that these states use to comply. And I think that's a very reasonable assumption. Those conversations are still happening, whether RGGI needs to be amended or changed, or whether other states are going to join, are all things that are still TBD, to be determined. But I think that's the overwhelming story in the region. And the way that efficiency comes into play in the RGGI program in a lot of states is that the states auction the allowances, and then they take the revenues from those auctions and invest them in clean energy, a lot of which is energy efficiency. And they have funded a lot of emission reductions from energy efficiency through those investments. In addition, we kind of lumped Pennsylvania into the Northeast for these purposes. Pennsylvania is not currently participate in RGGI, but they have been a national leader in forging ahead to develop their compliance plan. We actually just this week, I think it was this week that we had our market transformation conference, and our keynote speaker was Secretary Quigley from Pennsylvania, who announced that though the state had committed to submit a plan in September of 2016, that they are still proceeding with planning, but wouldn't submit a plan while there is a stay in effect. So I think that's the latest I have heard about what's going on with compliance planning in Pennsylvania. But they are definitely forging ahead. They are leading other states. They are very involved, and they're thinking about efficiency and the role it can play. Annie, for the next region.
Great, so let's move on to the Southeast. Here are results, state scorecard results for states in the region. What really sticks out to me here is how Arkansas is leading in the utility sector. You can see that big green bar there, much bigger than the points that are awarded in the utility sector for any other state in the region. And that is in large part due to their energy savings goals. Of course, I mentioned that there are plenty of opportunities here and the potential for real movement over the next year in Mississippi and Louisiana. And we can also see in this region that state governments are really taking steps to lead by example. So that's that darker blue top bar. Those are things like state investments in energy performance contracting, state commitments to energy savings through setting goals for their own buildings or holding state buildings to higher building energy codes than other buildings in the state. There are quite a few ways that states can lead by example, and it's often the first step we see state governments take in showing their commitment to energy efficiency, and you can see that it's the direction that a lot of states in this region are going. I didn't mention financing in the Northeast, but I probably should have. That is also something that's a hot topic in the Southeast. Our partner, the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, has a partnership with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, called the Southeast Energy Efficiency Finance Network, and they are exploring financing options for the region. Of course, we're seeing green banks pop up all over the country that are financing solutions for clean energy and energy efficiency, and that is a big focus in states like Connecticut and the Northeast, but I think it's something that we're also seeing as a real option for states in the Southeast. I would point out in particular here, Kentucky is really focused on developing their ESCO market, so companies delivering energy efficiency through the private market, and Tennessee is leading work on an energy efficiency registry so that states can accurately track energy savings delivered through all sectors, including the private sector. I think Sarah will talk a bit more about this, but the other big area of focus I see in the Southeast is EM&V. So figuring out how to evaluate, measure, and verify savings in an effective, accurate, affordable, and of course, uniquely Southern way. So I will turn it over to her with that.
Thanks, Annie. So we're actually really excited about what's happening in the Southeast. We think that there's some kind of opportunity for just about every state. As Annie pointed out, some of the big issues are figuring out evaluation, measurement, and verification. We also think that energy affordability, maintaining rates for low-income and multifamily customers, especially because a lot of these states are pretty heavy electric generators, and some of them are even constructing new nuclear power plants. Maintaining affordability is going to be really critical, and using energy efficiency to do that is one tool that those states have. We also think that non-utility approaches, so Annie talked about the importance of utility-run energy efficiency programs in a lot of states. We think in the Southeast there's a real opportunity to expand in some of the other areas, particularly having businesses, energy service contracts, the private sector provide some of this energy efficiency, and opening up some markets we think is something that could be really successful in the Southeast. I listed just a handful of the states here to talk about some of their reactions, and we don't have time for me to get into much detail here. South Carolina has been a leader. They have some great staff who are very engaged in thinking hard about this and have done some really robust stakeholder processes. North Carolina, it seems like for a while there was some talk that made it seem like that things were not going to progress, but in a way that we were hoping. But I think there are now some discussions happening about energy efficiency and its role to play. In Virginia, we've seen some great leadership from the governor and some work there by different folks who are coming together to think hard about energy savings goals and the role energy efficiency can play in the energy future for the state. Kentucky had been a national leader, and then they had a change of leadership and went totally the other direction. I'm hopeful that they are going to be increasingly open to talking about the role energy efficiency can play. And I think an important note is earlier when I said, I showed a map that talked about how many states are planning for the Clean Power Plan. In the Southeast states, they too know that a regulation is coming. So even though the rhetoric might be, we're not actively planning for Clean Power Plan, and that might well be true. I think there is still a lot of room to be thinking about and talking about energy efficiency and the role it has to play in the state, both for maintaining reliability and affordability, but also for reducing pollutants, including CO2, but also NOx and SOx and some of the other pollutants that those states are going to be trying to tackle.
Okay, we're at our last region that we're going to cover here, the Southwest. What we're seeing here is a bit of a mixed bag. Last year we saw some threats to the Arizona Energy Efficiency Resource Standard, but those have been successfully assuaged. In New Mexico and Nevada, we're seeing interest from commissioners in new technologies and new program designs. We've had ACEEE staff down there to both of those states to chat with regulators and lawmakers, sort of the new directions in energy efficiency. I'll also point out that Texas was one of our most improved states in the 2015 state scorecard, and you can see here that a large portion of its points come from building energy codes. That's that yellow bar there. They've also done a lot of work in addition to just code stringency. They've done a lot of work around code compliance, so making sure that builders understand building codes, that buildings are actually built to the code that is set in law, which is a really important activity for states to undertake. A lot of states are partnering with U.S. Department of Energy for that work, but there are also a lot of states that are leading the way on their own through activities like convening stakeholder groups and engaging utilities in the process by allowing them to claim savings for their work in encouraging, enforcing building energy codes. So Sarah, I'll let you have the last word on this region.
Thanks, Annie. So as Annie pointed out, the Southwest is pretty diverse in terms of its treatment of energy efficiency and its position relative to, or the position of different states relative to the Clean Power Plan goals. Colorado, for example, is a leader. It's well positioned to comply with the Clean Power Plan. Wyoming has a big lift, and energy efficiency alone, you know, when we do our kitchen sink scenario using the Super 2 tool, it's not going to be enough. So Wyoming is going to have to think hard about what it's going to do to comply. Texas has tons of opportunities to deploy energy efficiency, but there just has been a lack of political will. It's been a leader in the past, and it could be again. I'm not going to speculate about what happens in Texas, but I'm hopeful. So just a quick word on what's next, and then I think we're going to transition to questions pretty quickly. But EPA is going to continue to review the comments and develop guidance on the comments that were submitted and develop guidance on the Clean Power Plan. If you go to their website, they've recently posted an announcement saying they're respectful of this day, but they're going to continue thinking about this and helping states think about it. States are continuing to plan. We talked through some of these states already, and I showed you that map where you can hunt around for more information about that. And the energy efficiency community, I think, still has a lot of work to do. Working with air regulators, stakeholders that have not necessarily been heavily engaged in energy efficiency in the past. Some of them have, but not all of them. And understanding how efficiency reduces CO2, but also other pollutants like NOx and SOx and some of these different air regulations that are coming down the pipe. Efficiency is a solution for all of them, so how do those things fit together and how do we talk about that?
Okay, great. Thank you so much to both our presenters, Sarah and Annie, for a great overview of each of the regions and what everyone is thinking about in terms of Clean Power Plan compliance and things that are on the radar. This is just a quick slide that'll show a smattering of ACEEE resources, both our state policy resources, which includes the state score sheets, as you can see on the right-hand side there. Annie went through each of the charts for the region, but each state also has a fact sheet that gives all of the quick results, and you can find them at that link there. Also, we have a state and local policy database, and it shows California as an example here on that on this slide. So you can find pretty much everything and anything you've ever wanted to know about energy efficiency details for the state, and all that information, a lot of it gets included in the scorecard as well. We also have our Clean Power Plan resource page listed here. We've got a lot of some questions also about a link to the Super 2 calculator, our state utility pollution reduction version 2 calculator, and that you can see the link here. You can also find that linked on our CPP resource page, as well as all of our other Clean Power Plan research and resources. So here's a quick plug for our upcoming webinar in April. It will be on low-income energy efficiency programs and investments on April 21st. Here's a link to register. We will also have this up on our Clean Power Plan page, and again, you can get it from these slides, which I'll be sending around the next week or so to all those who have registered for the webinar. On this webinar, we'll be hearing from 2 ACEEE staff members, Lauren Ross and Rachel Cluett, and they'll be talking about recent publications on these topics, so stay tuned. So now we are going to dive into questions. We've already received quite a bit. And of course, if you want any, you have any follow-up discussions or any questions that didn't get answered, here is the contact information for both of our presenters, so you can feel free to email them directly as well. Let's see, so I'm just going to start going through our questions, and again, if you have any, we'll spend the next 10 to 15 minutes going through them, but if you have any that you can think of in that time, feel free to type them in, and we'll hopefully get to them. So for the first question, we have, and I'll give this question to Sarah, why are there some states that are exempt from Clean Power Plan compliance? And in particular, those states are Vermont and DC, and then also in the final rule, Alaska and Hawaii. So Sarah, can you speak to why EPA has left out those states?
Sure. So, and Cassandra, if you want to just, I know you know the answer to this, so you're welcome to jump in, but without getting too technical, this is a regulation for existing fossil fuel-fired power plants of a certain size, and if a state doesn't have those, then there's nothing to regulate. So Vermont and DC were, they don't have power plants that would qualify for this regulation. And I think that's all I want to get into on the detail of it, unless Cassandra, you want to add anything.
Yeah, definitely. And for the states like Alaska and Hawaii, EPA didn't have a sufficient amount of data on those states. So, it's still possible that they could get targets in the future, but at this time they're not included for having to comply with the rule. So, okay, great. Thank you. And the next question will be for Annie. We had a question coming in on when you were talking about the utility business model. So first, what does LRAM mean? And then also, how does decoupling help adoption of energy efficiency programs and or initiatives?
Sure. So I showed on the map that there are a variety of ways that state regulators can incentivize utilities to invest in energy efficiency. So under a traditional utility business model, utilities make money by selling energy. Why would they want to invest in energy efficiency if what they're doing is chipping away at their sales? But we all know that it's in the public interest to invest in energy efficiency. In addition to the benefits for air quality and emissions, there are direct results for customers' energy bills and the money that they're able to put elsewhere in the economy, not just toward their utility bill. So to encourage utilities to invest in energy efficiency, regulators need to think about ways to make it in the utility's interest to make those investments. They could, in theory, force utilities to make these investments, but we really want to get utilities on board. So there are a variety of ways to do that. One of the key pieces of the puzzle is decoupling, so essentially breaking the link between utility sales and the amount of revenues they're able to earn. And that makes them sort of neutral when it comes to energy efficiency, because their revenue doesn't depend directly on the amount of sales that they're able to sell to customers. They can invest in energy efficiency without any concerns that it will eat away at their bottom line. LRAM stands for Lost Revenue Adjustment Mechanism, and it is similar to decoupling. We call it sort of a step on the way to decoupling. Certainly not the preferable option because it's complicated. What it means is that a utility forecasts how much energy savings they'll get through programs. They do EM&V on their savings, and based on those, they calculate the amount of revenues that were lost as a result of energy efficiency programs. Then they work with regulators to recoup those revenues. We found that in practice, it's usually messy, complicated, takes a lot of time on both the utility and the regulator's part, but it is oftentimes sort of a solution that folks can get behind as they get used to the idea of decoupling.
Great, thank you. And we did get a couple more questions in about wondering if the slides will be available, and is this webinar being recorded? It is being recorded, and we will be sending around a link to that recording to all those who have registered for the webinar within the next week or so, along with a link to access the slides. So next we have a question about building energy codes. In Virginia, for example, they have adopted the code but significantly weakened it through striking most third-party verification and other components. So Annie, can you speak to the significance of not just adopting the code, but having, making sure that there's a compliance enforcement mechanism in there? And then Sarah, I'm going to ask you how it is that building energy codes could be counted and or used in some way for compliance. So first we'll start with Annie.
Sure. I would just say that Virginia is not alone in being a state that adopts some weakening amendments to its building energy codes. It's something that certainly not every state does, but there are plenty of states that adopt kind of unique amendments, state-specific amendments. Sometimes they're weakening, sometimes they're strengthening. We look at overall energy savings associated with the codes in the state's scorecard. So if a state adopts a 2015 building energy code with weakening amendments, we don't hold that to be equivalent with the 2015 building energy code. As a state is planning for the Clean Power Plan, actual energy savings resulting from a building energy code are what really matters. So I'll turn it to Sarah to talk a little more about that.
Hi. So I guess I would say states have been doing building codes for quite a long time. I think we have 40, if not more, states that have energy building codes in place. So there's a tremendous amount of confidence that they are saving. And I think the question really is along the margin of how many of the actors are not doing what they're supposed to do. And so there has been a lot of work done to try to identify what portion of the market that is, and PNNL National Labs has developed some tools and some great resources to assist with that. Also, EPA has issued a technical guidance resource on EM&V with its Clean Power Plan rulemaking, and there's a section in there that specifically addresses building codes and spells out some recommended methods for handling evaluation, measurement, and verification of energy savings from building codes. So I'm not going to read through that, but I will refer people to it as a great resource to get some pretty specific instruction about how a state could do that for Clean Power Plan compliance.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And next question is for Annie. Real quickly, so you had shown on your bar charts Virginia and Texas. And for Virginia, they have a negative energy savings through utility programs. Is there any reason why for this? And also, why does Texas have such a low score on utilities? And does that also take into account the large amount of wind energy that they have in the state?
Sure. So I'll speak to Virginia first. So they don't have negative energy savings, but they do receive a negative score from us in the most recent state scorecard, and that's because we're looking at both policies and savings achieved through that sector. So Virginia achieved a pretty pretty low amount of energy savings, but they do have utilities running programs. However, we're also looking at sort of negative policy trends. I mentioned industrial opt-out. That is a policy category where states can earn negative points, and Virginia did earn negative points. So in addition to the negative points there, they also did not earn points across the board in that sector because they're really not keeping pace with what other states are doing in the utility sector. That said, I will just mention that they have a governor who's very committed to energy efficiency and is really working on ways to ramp up energy efficiency in the private sector, and some of this could eventually roll into the utility sector as well. For Texas, they also have a low score in the utility sector. That has nothing to do with their renewable energy. So we're looking only at energy efficiency policies and programs to achieve energy savings. Obviously, renewable energy is a huge and important component of the Clean Power Plan. Efficiency is also an important component, and they are, separate but can work together. So here we're only looking at energy efficiency. Texas was the first state to adopt an energy efficiency resource standard in 1999, but it is extremely low compared to the energy savings goals that other states have in place.
Great, thank you. The next question has to do with CHP, and I guess before I get into this next question, we are coming up at our time here at 2:30, although there are a couple of other questions that have come through the line, so we'll plan to stick around for another 5 minutes or so. But again, if you have a question that didn't get answered, please feel free to contact our presenters directly at their emails here. So next one is about CHP. I was wondering if you could speak more about the role that CHP could play nationally in helping to meet our emission reduction goals. I am going to actually punt the details of that answer and for our next webinar, actually coming up in May, we are going to have Megan Kelly speak on that webinar, and she is our CHP guru, and she's been doing all things CPP and CHP related. So she can speak in great detail to how CHP could go about helping with emission reductions. But spoiler alert, it can, and EPA still has to come out with a little bit more information about how it can count, particularly in a rate-based approach. But I'll let Megan answer that question during our following webinars. The next part of that question is, what are the best state and national policies to support increased CHP deployment, given that it was one of the metrics that we use for the state scorecard? So I'll have Annie answer that one.
Sure. I'm sure Megan will also talk about this in more detail, so I'll just mention a couple of things that we look at in the state scorecard, and there are certainly more options for states. But one of the things we look at is how states use combined heat and power as a resource. So states can include specific goals for CHP deployment within their energy savings goals. States can also offer technical assistance to customers who would like to implement CHP projects. And that can be done through state energy offices as well as utility-provided technical assistance. It's also important for states to consider the ease with which CHP can connect to the grid. So having things in place like clear, simple interconnection standards is another important policy that states need to consider.
Great, thank you, Annie. And next, we have a couple of questions which I'll just answer quickly. One was, what state office is responsible for developing the state plans? And I think this question may have been asked before Sarah got through her whole presentation, but that is the state air offices in each state. So it can go by different names. Sometimes it's Department of Environment or Department of Environmental Protection or something of the like, but it would be the air office that is responsible. And other state agencies can contribute to that compliance plan development, such as a state energy office or a public utility commission. We also had a question come through asking about the role of energy planning in the states, and is that a part of the compliance plan development, or what role does that play? So Sarah, I'll throw that question to you.
Sorry, I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
So, so the question has to do with states who are involved in, say, energy planning every 5 years or so with various stakeholders in the state. Does that energy planning process coincide with clean power plan planning,
Sure.
or are those two different things?
So I was trying to get at some of that in my remarks earlier. In some states, those things are being gelled together, those different processes. But I would say largely they have worked historically independently. We have had states where the environmental regulator and the air regulator develops plans to comply with federal regulations for clean air. And often independent of that, we've had utility commissions and energy offices developing efficiency programs and policies that are implemented. And the two have not had a tremendous amount of overlap. Specifically, we've been reducing emissions, we've been reducing pollution through efficiency for decades, and the air regulators have not been taking credit for it in their planning. So does it happen separately? Yes, it has in the past. I am hopeful that states are going to start merging those things to be looking at them more comprehensively, and I think the Clean Power Plan has provided a mechanism for state air, utility, and energy regulators to get together and to talk about these things more comprehensively, and I think we're seeing that start to happen.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And we have two more quick questions. So one is, you mentioned Tennessee is working on an energy efficiency registry that would help states comply with the Clean Power Plan. Is that effort specific to the Southeast or beyond? It is, I'll just go ahead and answer that quickly. It's an effort that involves actually several states, including Tennessee, and also others such as Minnesota, and also other organizations such as NASIO and E for the Future and the Climate Registry. That project is just kicking off its stakeholder meetings to kind of help shape what the registry, what's important to the registry and what it should look like and what it should have in it. So if people are interested in getting involved in that process, the official title is called National Energy Efficiency Registry, so you can Google that. It's also called NEAR, and it'll pop up a website and you can get involved that way. So the last question will be for Annie, and it has to do with the cost effectiveness of energy efficiency. Can you address generally how the cost effectiveness of efficiency is determined? Also, as an example, this person's utility in their state does not believe that their DSM or demand side management program is cost effective, yet everywhere that I read, energy efficiency is the lowest cost resource and the lowest cost means to reduce emissions. So can you speak a little bit to how cost effectiveness of energy efficiency is determined and how we know that it's the lowest cost resource, and also about our EM&V resources and tools that we have available?
Sure. Well, just first to point you toward our EM&V toolkit, we have on our state policy page that Cassandra, I believe, linked to. You can click around there and you'll find our state policy toolkit that does include some resources on EM&V. We also have a breakdown of evaluation methods, a 20-foot view of what they're doing in every state on our state policy database. So take a look there. The important question here is the cost effectiveness of EM&V. And every few years, we're gearing up pretty soon probably to do a new one. ACEEE takes a look at how much it costs across the country to implement energy efficiency programs. What we found is that it costs about 2.6 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the cheapest resource there is. So if you're really thinking of how a utility can meet demand, it's important to think of energy efficiency as a supply-side resource equivalent to building a new coal plant or a new natural gas plant. and comparing those costs to each other. I would also add that every state does have a requirement that nearly all energy efficiency programs delivered by utilities be cost effective. And one kind of key piece of the puzzle is getting those tests for cost effectiveness right. So it's going to vary based on avoided costs that utilities face in different parts of the country, but we also see that it varies a lot based on the tests that utilities use to determine cost effectiveness and what the benefits are that they're looking at. This is a super wonky subject, and we can really dive into the weeds here. I would be happy to talk more about it if you just shoot me a note after this webinar, but I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Annie. And thank you to both our presenters, Sarah Hayes and Annie Gilio, for giving great overviews of where things are at in each state with energy efficiency policies and programs and with Clean Power Plan compliance planning and outreach efforts. And thank you all for joining us, and we do encourage you to join us on our next webinar, which will be in April. And please visit our Clean Power Plan resource page to get the link to the next webinar. And be sure to look out in your email for a recording of this webinar. And thank you so much.